All right, so let's talk about the river bottom buck and how to hunt him. Before I start on my strategy, I just want to say something regarding what I said in the video. When I first found this bed, I was recording everything live off the cuff with not even the expectation necessarily of making it into a video anytime soon. And it was the beginning of the summer when I first discovered this bed, and I stayed out of there the rest of that year until hunting season, which in Pennsylvania is the beginning of October. And it was the middle of October till I got to this location. And yes, I know a lot of people prefer doing their scouting early in the year, right after hunting season closes, and I'm one of those people. But that's not to say that you can't scout other times as well. I try to refrain from being out in the woods very much, except for surveillance stands in August and September. But in this case, it was probably June, if I remember correctly. And I can't say for certain it was the same buck, but by the size of that bed, I'm pretty sure it would have been the same buck. And yes, he was in fact in his bed when I tried to hunt him. But one of the comments that I made was that the little swale that created this little jut was an area that just kind of was wet when we had a heavy rain. And I didn't realize it till I looked afterwards, but it was actually a real stream bottom and considerable depth to the water. Not a real fast moving stream, but definitely a stream. In most places, you wouldn't be able to wade across it without going in over your head. So I just wanted to make sure that that's clear. And the stream actually flows in this direction. So kind of from the westerly area to the eastern direction. And without a doubt, the number one stream crossing off of this peninsula is right in here. And that's because the water in this area, there are some slight riffles, I guess you could call them that. It's a meandering stream, so it doesn't have a lot of fast flow, but it's as close to riffles as you're going to get on a stream like this. And because the water is lower there, you could probably cross up to your waist, or maybe even lower if the water level is low. That's where almost all the deer are crossing if they're coming across the water. And you might recall, I referred to this bed here in my own mind as a king size bed. I've never seen a bed this big. I mean, it was like the buck had just eaten away all the vegetation in that area. Everything had fallen just perfectly, and he could have turned around in there multiple times and not bumped into anything. But he has 3 escape routes. The first one is the one that I showed, the angle that I showed you from, and that actually comes out the side here right toward the river. And it's only a jump and you're into the water. I was actually standing right on the edge of the riverbank and didn't even realize it because it was so grown up with vegetation. But this gives the buck a couple of options. He can actually meander down this peninsula, and there's lots of food for him to eat in this area here. He can come up the other direction, and then he has a multitude of options, really. He can go upstream on the river. There tends to be lots of really good vegetation for deer to eat along rivers and streams, a lot of nutritious stuff for them to consume. Then he could actually also go the opposite direction and go downstream and find plenty of food to eat there, although it does turn more wooded in this area here. Or he could actually go up into the woods here, although I suspect he would not do that during hunting season, at least not until after dark, because all the hunting pressure comes from over in this area. Over on this side is private land, and you don't have to go very far to get into that private land. And the ag is also on this side over here. It's off of the map, but there is a really distinct couple of food sources that I would expect the deer to really be heading in that direction. to eat for their uh, main meal of the evening. So that was one of the exits. The other exit went the exact opposite direction, and that was an exit that I believe went right over here to the crossing. And then there was a really good trail that came up along here. And then the third option, I get the opinion it was kind of like his safety exit, if you will, came out this direction. And again, that gives him a lot of options. He can hook down here to the, to the main crossing. He can go up the creek. He can cross the creek if it's an emergency and he needs to get out of the area. So that gives you a little bit of background on, the exits, the ag, the pressure, and what I expect this buck to have done. So if you've watched the other two videos on how to hunt mature buck beds, that actual beds that I discovered had actual mature bucks in them on public land in the northeastern part of the United States, you're probably beginning to see a pattern. I almost always am really keenly aware of where the pressure is coming from, especially from hunters. And I'm also keenly aware of where potential and even most likely food sources are. Because deer spend their lives moving from bedding to food and back and forth. And of course, during the rut, mating moves into that mix, but that's generally what deer do. They survive by bedding and eating, back and forth. So I'm looking at those scenarios generally, no matter where I find a good buck bed. But there are some specific things that are unique to each ecosystem that you're hunting. In the mountain buck bed setting, obviously, I'm really paying attention to the wind and thermals especially. And, the food sources are not as strong, but realizing that there are a lot of oaks and a heavy crop of acorns on any particular year can really change how a buck might respond and move distinctly from a year where you don't have a lot of acorns. And when you have a swamp island buck like I showed you, paying attention to the nuanced cover and what kinds of food sources are available in the swamp versus what is exterior from the swamp, and about how far I think the buck's going to move. Those are really important things to consider. When it comes to river bottoms, one of the things that you really want to think about, at least in the northeastern part of the United States, and really any part that is in the northern tier of the whitetail range, is that you find a lot of annuals in these river bottoms as far as vegetation goes. So a lot of warm season grasses, you have a lot of ironweed and goldenrod and other warm season types of vegetation. And some of them stand up better than others to heavy rain and snow. But what I've noticed over time is that almost always the best beds in river bottoms are occupied by mature bucks, most frequently in the early season. For us in Pennsylvania, New York, some of the adjacent states, that would be October and maybe the first part of November. We usually get some kind of accumulation of snow by sometime in November, and that often knocks down the vegetation and it opens those deer up to visibility, and they often vacate these locations. Now, the jury's still out on this buck because I only got to hunt him one time. It was very early in the season, the second week of the season, middle of October, and I'll tell you about that in just a second. But there is a lot of perennial vegetation on this peninsula. Grapevine, which obviously will lose its leaves but still has some structure. Dogwood, both rhodosier and swamp dogwood. There was also a fair amount of willow, and again, that loses its leaves, but the stems tend to be pretty highly concentrated, and so you've got a lot of visual protection. So I'm not sure how long this buck would actually stay here. all things being created equal otherwise. But I'm thinking to hunt river bottom locations often in the beginning of the season, because I know that that vegetation is going to die with the heavy frost, and it's probably going to get knocked down. If you get a rain that goes above the riverbanks, it can flatten them, and once the frost has killed the plant, it's not going to rebound and come back up. Or if you get a snow, it's going to knock that vegetation down too. So I went in the middle of October, and my tactic was, and I'll just draw this so you can see, but I was farther back in the woods, was to go way downstream. And I actually crossed the stream at a spot that was reasonable. It was probably between an eighth and a quarter of a mile downstream. And there's a variety of reasons that go into that, and I don't want to give away the location, so I'll just leave it at that. But I came in up through here, and ultimately what I did is I set up right about here. Now, it's important for me to show you this spot. This is where I was putting my tree stand. And on the day that I was hunting, the wind was actually very steady, but not super strong, maybe 8 or 10 miles per hour. But it was coming out of the west-southwest. So a lot of times people think that you always figure out which way is the wind blowing, and you want to set up directly opposite so that the wind's blowing in your face. And sometimes that works. But oftentimes I've found that mature bucks especially, they seem to feel really safe whenever they're heading in a direction. And again, I've stated this before, I don't think that a buck, when he gets up at night, has to have the wind at his back. That just doesn't hold any water. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that he is completely carefree about the wind. And so when the wind is blowing in a way that makes him feel extra secure, if he gets up out of this bed and he exits along here, he's actually kind of heading into the wind, not directly, but it's blowing across him. He's got good visual sight then. He crosses the water here. Now the wind is at his back and he can kind of see in front of him here. That, as he's heading off north to the ag fields, that can make him feel really secure. So you might expect me to set up down here or even to push the envelope and come out this peninsula. But the reason that I didn't is because, remember, all the pressure is coming from this area over here. And the food source is to the north. So I really expect this buck, all things being created equal, unless something weird happens. And for sure, something weird did happen. He's going to go north here. And so I'm going to set up as tightly as I can to him without giving away my visual location to him, but realizing he's probably not going to go real far before it gets dark and I lose shooting light. So what I did is I came to this spot, and my intention was to get as high as I could reasonably, at least 20 feet high, maybe even higher. And knowing that there was a steady wind, I figured my scent would blow out in this direction. Any deer, doe, and younger bucks that would get up, and there's a lot of them like in this area and over in here and even along the edge of the swamp in this area, would pass by me, and they wouldn't get my scent until they were already moved off into the food location, the ag fields. And then, if they spook a little bit, no big deal. I've also noticed over time, and remember I said this stream doesn't have a lot of flow to it, but there's not a lot of thermal action in this location because this is almost completely flat ground. There's a little bit of change, but we're not talking much. So the thermal action is limited, but I have noticed over the years that thermals will oftentimes pull downstream with the flow of the water. Not quickly, but in general, if you're spilling your scent into the water, it's going to usually flow downstream. And that makes sense because you've got flow, and that little bit of flow in the water creates a little bit of movement, a little bit of circular action with the air directly above the stream, and that can start a tumbling effect. So if for some reason the wind switched, I was hoping that that would be the case. I got my first step onto the tree that I found that was going to be what I thought to be an excellent setup. And I heard this humming sound, and from down the stream where I had crossed comes a drone. And it's actually flying along the flow of the stream, opposite of the stream, but it's following the contour of the stream. It got to about right here, and the buck actually bolted in this direction, somewhere, to the west. And if you've ever heard a buck or any deer, but especially a big animal, bolt through warm season grasses and cattails, it's loud. So he not only made a lot of sound crossing the water, but all the way through, I believe he crossed over into this wooded area. And then on the opposite side of this little point here are some more warm season grasses and more of the swampy river bottom. And I think he probably ended up over there. I thought I heard him actually going into that area. But the drone, I don't know. I think it was just a freak situation. I don't think the person knew I was there at all. But it circled up around here and went up the river and eventually circled back around somewhere, to the south here. And I never did see the big buck during that hunt. It was the only hunt that I had on this buck. I probably should have gone back in after him, but I've got a lot of different spots to hunt, and I also have a family to take care of, and so you're balancing a lot of things in life. So I proceeded after he bolted to set up as quickly and quietly as I could to get as high as I could and to surveil this area. I did not get a sighting of this buck at all. And I saw some smaller bucks and lots of does, and my suspicions were confirmed. Almost all of the deer movement I saw was coming up out of the swamp area or from over in, the northwest corner and heading toward the ag fields. And it worked. I could have shot a couple of other bucks, but they were not what I was after, and certainly some does. But I'll just say that when a big buck gets spooked, especially when it's a freak occurrence like a drone, you never know how a deer will respond to that. He may run, a couple hundred yards and bed down and not get up until it's after dark, because I don't know how many times he's actually encountered a drone. They're becoming more and more popular, but I don't know. Maybe he's never seen one of those. Other bucks may return to the bed before it's even dark, or they may come back the next day, or they may wait a couple of days or weeks. It all depends. So I put myself in that position because I was holding out for that buck, and I wasn't successful in getting a sighting of him. And I just want to say one final tip. I made this mistake many, many times in the first couple of years that I hunted. When you're hunting river bottoms, not so much out here in the warm season grasses, although it can be true there, but I'm talking about these areas like along here. You're not into the true woods yet, but neither is it really warm season grasses. You have really, really dense stuff. You have vines that are growing that you can get tangled up in. I'm talking about annual vines that put on 20 or 30 feet of growth in 1 year. And deer are much shorter than we are. And so they have their paths picked out. We can't go through some of those areas. And so you have incredibly dense vegetation all along this creek bottom. Even in here, there was a lot of it, although there's more warm season grasses in this area here. But I knew there was no way I was going to get in here on this peninsula, really. So my point is, make sure that you pick a spot that not only gives you an opportunity to see the buck, but also gives you an opportunity to make a shot. I've put myself in locations numerous times, again, the first couple of years that I hunted, where I saw trophy bucks, but it would have been impossible, I think even with a rifle in many cases, to harvest them. So if you can't actually shoot, your spot is not good enough unless you just want to have a good glimpse at a trophy buck. So make sure that you have at least one really good quality shooting lane. And again, on public land, you can't cut vegetation. So you're left with whatever is there. I had 2 spots that I could shoot through reasonably, and I felt like I could get a shot off. I had, a window that was wide enough to really get a good quality ethical shot off. But if you're setting up in a tree and you're staying out of his scent world, and he doesn't even know you're there, but you can't make a shot on the way he's going to exit, it's a worthless spot for you to hunt. If you haven't liked or subscribed or turned on notifications, please do that so you don't miss any of the new videos that I upload. And I appreciate so much when you share these videos with your hunting buddies. If you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. Just put them in the comments below. Until next time, I'm Daryl with Seeds to Dreams Deer. I hope you find more than you think you're hunting for.